The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we'll be speaking with General Frank McKenzie, the Executive Director of the University of South Florida Global and National Security Institute, which he took over in May of 2022. In July of 2022, he became the Executive Director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. In July 2017, he was named the Director, Joint Staff. General McKenzie was promoted to the grade of General and assumed the command of United States Central Command, CENTCOM, in March of 2019. He relinquished command of CENTCOM and retired from the Marine Corps on the 1st of April 2022, completing over 42 years of service. General McKenzie, welcome to the show from Tampa.
I'm delighted to join you today.
General McKenzie, I would like to start off with a quick question about your time at U.S. Central Command. So as U.S. Central Command Commander, what do you think your greatest accomplishment was, and what was your greatest challenge?
So as you know, Central Command, 21 nations from Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, to Yemen in the south, really is at where a lot of religions come together, where a lot of vital trade links come together, where a lot of old passions never lie very far beneath the surface. So it's always a bubbling pot. As the Central Command Commander, you're looking at 4 or 5 crises at any one time. I would tell you, I think one of the things that I'm the proudest of is we generally maintained deterrence of Iran during my 3 years in command. As you know, we did exchange fire with them on several occasions, but we prevented large-scale state-on-state conflict. We kept them in the box. They were not able to pursue their malign hegemonic ambitions across the region. And I think that's one of the most significant things that I accomplished while I was there. There were many other things that we did there that we can talk about if you'd like. But I think in the broad strokes of history, that's the thing that I'm the most comfortable with as part of my legacy. I think the challenges that you confront in Central Command really are how do you ensure that we maintain focus on this region when there are so many good reasons to focus on China in the Western Pacific and Russia in Eastern Europe. And the fact of the matter is, a central cockpit of that competition with both those countries remains the Middle East. And so the challenge of articulating that both inside the United States government and to our partners, friends, and allies is a core challenge that any Central Command commander faces.
Excellent. General McKenzie, what are the challenges to ending the Ukraine war, and what are the issues to be resolved, and how do you see the conflict ending? And also, as a follow-up to this question, what is the probability of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon in the conflict?
So I think this war is now pushing 18 months in duration. Vladimir Putin thought it would be a quick, opportunistic grab of a piece of land that he feels is vital to Russia. It is an existential issue for Vladimir Putin. And I think when we talk about how the war is going, how it might end, and what the chances for the future are, we need to understand that when we talk about Russia, we're only talking about one person. We're talking about Vladimir Putin. There's no other source of power in Russia. And that's, people tend to think that dictators can actually move fast and make good decisions. But I think the broad sweep of history would tell us that's not the case. Typically, they're surrounded by sycophants because they get rid of everyone else who's going to give them contrary advice. So they don't necessarily get good advice. They tend to live in an echo chamber that actually has the effect of accentuating their own beliefs. So Putin probably got into this war on bad advice. He has not fought it well. His military has proven itself to be largely incapable of sustained offensive action. The first month of the war was the most significant embarrassment for Russian arms, really, since the opening days of Barbarossa in June 1941. They were proved inept at really everything they tried to do. We were surprised by that. I was surprised by that, and I spent the first half of my career studying the Russians very closely. At the beginning of this war, our intelligence was very good about what the Russians wanted to do. And I think we, the United States, deployed that information brilliantly to marshal support for Ukraine and for like-minded nations who wanted to see, the rule of law be key in international relations and not the rule of force and the ability to strike your neighbor. So I think we did that very well, but I think we were not as good at understanding the problems that are inherent to the Russian military. And those problems are, it comes down to the fighting heart of the soldier. How well are Russian soldiers going to fight? Well, not very well, because they know it's not a defensive war, it's an offensive war. It's a war of choice for Putin, and that's affected them. Additionally, by the end of the Second World War, nobody was better at the Russians than deep operational maneuver. They knew how to throw masses of tanks around the battlefield. They know how to use en masse artillery, second to none. Nobody was better than them. And they've forgotten all that. And so to watch the ineptitude of the Russians early on in this war, staggering. And we did not foresee that. So what's happened is you've got a stalemate. Putin has seized a large chunk of Ukraine, to include the Crimea, and large chunks to the east. Larger thrusts toward Kyiv have been soundly defeated by the Ukrainians. But now you've settled into a period where the Ukrainians have gone on the counteroffensive, and what they've been able to do is apply. Matter is, there's an old saying in the U.S. military: maneuver without fire is disastrous. Fire without maneuver is indecisive. And we saw a maneuver without effective fire at the beginning of the campaign, which was disastrous for the Russians. Now we're seeing the Ukrainians applying great fire against the Russians, but they're unable to maneuver. They're unable to maneuver because, for one, the Russians have sown so many mines in eastern Ukraine that it's a breaching operation. And I can tell you from firsthand practical experience, the only operation on the battlefield more difficult than sustained breaching in the face of the enemy is an amphibious operation. It's very difficult to make ground like this. The Ukrainians have probably not air. Well, let me back up a moment. The Russians have marginal air superiority. They're able to fly some of their airplanes. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, operate a large and capable fleet of drones that they've used with great effect, and our medium and short range missiles that we've used. So you've sort of got another stalemate in the air. Where the air defense systems of each contender are so great, air power has not been able to make itself effectively felt. Additionally, Ukraine doesn't have a lot of airplanes. I know we're talking about giving them F-16s from countries in Europe, and certainly that's going to be helpful. But we should remember that the F-16 is just an airplane. What makes a U.S. F-16 so effective is the air battle management radar that tells it where to go, the airplanes that fly to suppress enemy air defenses, missiles that shoot at it. All of those things are the secret sauce of Western air power. You can't just giving someone an F-16 doesn't give them that secret sauce. So we need to be wary of that. So where are we now as we begin the early fall in Ukraine? The Ukrainian offensive is having limited gains. I'm not prepared to say it's not going to break through yet, because it's a test of wills, and you never know. But they have been hesitant, I think, to put in large formations to try to exploit, because they don't feel that they've had a successful breach. I don't follow it closely enough to have a better informed opinion than that. But I think I still believe time ultimately works for Ukraine, because Putin has got to demonstrate success. And where he's at now, he cannot demonstrate success. So that leads me to the second part of your question. What are the odds of Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon? Well, here's what leads it to consider that. Russian theory, Soviet theory, and Putin's personal theory is you get into trouble, you escalate to de-escalate. You raise the stakes so that the other party doesn't want to remain seated at the table with you. Putin has run out of things, or is running out of things he can do to raise the stakes in this conflict. They've attacked Kyiv, they've fired missiles, they've done all sorts of things. Not much left for him to do that doesn't involve ratcheting it up to nuclear weapons. And here, he actually has a pretty broad cupboard that he can go to and take weapons out of. At the end of the Cold War, we, the United States and our Western allies, largely divested ourselves of our tactical nuclear weapons, believing we had an agreement with the Russians that they would do the same. So today, as I speak to you, there are probably less than 300 tactical nuclear weapons in the U.S. NATO inventory. B-61 TAC-4 gravity-delivered weapons that would have to be flown to the target by an airplane. The Russians have between 2,000 and 4,000 tactical nuclear weapons. And these weapons are not susceptible to arms control limitations. They've never been part of the strategic arms negotiations that we've had with the Russians. Russia has a vast store of tactical nuclear weapons, and they have options to deliver them. Despite that, I think it is unlikely, barring a significant setback in Ukraine, that he would choose to use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. I think he will use a tactical nuclear weapon to signal escalation. It could be a detonation inside Russian territory, could be something exo-atmospheric, might be something out of the North Atlantic, who knows? Those are all possibilities. I think it is very unlikely that he would use one where it would actually kill people in its first employment. Now, having said that, the movement of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia into Belarus is very concerning, because I think that lowers the bar to use and perhaps creates the circumstances where there could be a radiological incident in Belarus that who knows how it could happen, that might give him an opportunity to say, well, this happened, we've been attacked in Belarus, our weapons are vulnerable, and now we have to strike back. So I think that is very concerning, and I'll pause there.
Thank you, General McKenzie. That was very sobering, honestly. I want to turn to something that you said earlier about your legacy in containing Iran, and that is that one common criticism of the U.S. and its foreign policy is that it is difficult for us to walk and chew gum at the same time. Right now, our focus is on Ukraine. However, are we able to effectively counter our adversaries in other regions from other great powers such as China, while at the same time spending so much time, money, and weaponry in supporting Ukraine?
Well, Michael, I think that's been a consistent challenge of U.S. foreign policy going back decades. But the truth of the matter is this: if you're going to be a global power, you have to think globally. And you have to recognize that if you're going to contain China, it has to be a global action, not just an action in the Western Pacific. If you're going to take action against Russia, it can't just be in Eastern Europe. You have to think globally. And that's where places like CENTCOM become very important, because of the flow of durable goods and services as well as commodities through the region. The outreach that China and Russia have in the region, you have to be able to, as you said, walk and chew gum at the same time. And our messaging, particularly in the Central Command region, over the last several years has been surprisingly inept. And it is, messaging should give pause to a potential opponent. It should reassure or assure your partners in the region, and it should give guidance to the Joint Force and the Diplomatic Corps about what we want to do. And I think we have, in various different times and in various measures, failed in all of those dimensions.
Excellent. Thank you, General McKenzie. I have a follow-up question. Looking at the relationship between Russia and Iran, Russia has been deepening its strategic trade and working to advance Tehran's military prowess. What threat does this pose to Washington?
So, this is a marriage of convenience. I don't think it's going to be a long-term. I don't know that it would become a long-term relationship. It's certainly very worrisome right now, and it's worrisome because Iran is shipping lots of drones and drone technology to Russia, which, if you stop to think about it, is a little surprising why that would be the case, and perhaps concerning if you're a Russian, actually, but regardless. And so I think as a result, Iran is gaining access to more Russian technology that will ultimately be used against us in the region. So I am concerned about this relationship, however, Russia actually has very limited financial resources. Russia has a very small one-dimensional economy. If Russia weren't armed with a staggering number of nuclear weapons, we wouldn't pay much of attention to Russia, but they are, and therefore we must. But Russia has limits on their ability actually to act on the world stage in an economic matter because of the single dimension of their economy and its small scale.
Perfect. General McKenzie, I want to turn to a time that was very important for you during when you were commander of CENTCOM. And now that we're back in an era of great power conflict, I want to ask about the global war on terror. Has the United States won the global war on terror, or is this still a problem that needs to be effectively dealt with? And if so, how should it be dealt with given the great power conflict going on now?
Well, Michael, we have not won it. It is going to continue, and we need to realize that. And perhaps we should adjust our rhetoric and use different language when we describe it. But the fact of the matter is that violent extremist groups continue to gain foothold in places that are poorly governed or not governed at all. They continue to aspire to attack us in our homeland and those of our partners in Europe as well. And so we need to recognize that. And so it is not going to be something where we're ever going to be able to declare victory. Instead, though, and this is a working definition that we've used for a while, is you want to be able to contain it. And you really ultimately want to be able to contain it at the local level where you don't need a large U.S. presence. It doesn't mean that we won't help. It doesn't mean that we won't enable. But you want local security forces in various countries around the world to be able to take action. Now, where we can be effective is looking at the connective tissue between, say, extremist groups in sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Africa or the Middle East and those in South America or other places where they try to move money, move terrorists, and things like that. But really, you want to get to the point where nations have the ability to take action inside their own borders without a significant U.S. presence. And I would tell you, to me, that's sort of the definition of victory. It's not a bloodless future. It's not a future where we're going to have a parade and say this is won, because we're not going to get there. But I think we have to take a long view on this. And then the other thing is, you need to take action to prevent it from happening, because local conditions are what produce extremists. Let me give you an example, a very discrete example. The Al-Hol refugee camp in Syria. There are about 50,000, depending on the day, 50 to 60,000 people in there, mainly children and women, because most of the men were Al-Qaeda were ISIS or other affiliates, and they're not there anymore. These are children that are in this camp. They're provided a subsistence level of existence because the Syrians won't let more than a tiny sliver of the UN in to help these people. But they subsist, they survive, and they are daily indoctrinated into ISIS. So these are children that a few years from now, we're going to reap the whirlwind unless we find a way to get in there, return these children to the places they come from, many from Iraq, some from Syria, but a surprising number from other nations, particularly Europe. We need to get nations to take responsibility for these expatriates. We need to get them to be returned. And then the thing we've got to concentrate on is, and this is a tough problem, how do you do effective de-radicalization? It's got to come from the region. You're not going to do it in North America. You've got to do it in the region. It's going to be expensive. There are nation states in the region, though, that have the resources and the capability to direct and assist in this de-radicalization. And that is look, you've got to change the conditions that foment the rise of violent extremism. I mean, that's not particularly insightful to say that. We know it, but it remains the truth. And we are not good at doing that. You'd rather turn a young boy when he's 8 or 10 to another path than have to fight him when he's 15.
Excellent. General McKenzie, how important is it hybrid warfare, and how can we preserve free and open institutions given the threats that it poses to democracy?
So, hybrid warfare is a term that covers a lot of different things. But one of the things that I'll pick one example of what I would call as part of hybrid warfare. For most of my career as a professional officer, the event was what was the most important. You maneuver forces, you create an event. Something happens. You win a battle, you do this, you do that, you do a training exercise, then you describe it and gain effect from it. This is what we did. In the world today, the event is increasingly irrelevant to messaging. You don't even have to have an event. I'll give you two examples from my theater with where I have personal knowledge of this. In the summer of 2021, you may recall summer of 2019, the Iranians shot down an RQ-4 drone over the Strait of near the Strait of Hormuz in the Arabian Gulf. The drone was clearly flying in international airspace, going about its own business. A low-level, reckless Iranian commander shot it down. So we wanted to message this, and it took me 24 hours or so after the drone was shot down. I'm still working to get an effective message out. Meanwhile, the the foreign minister of Iran, he's in Geneva. He draws a map on the back of a napkin that shows where the drone was in Iranian airspace, gets it up and begins talking about it. Now, it's patently false, but he's there first with the story. And when you don't care about the truth of the story, but you're just desiring to create an effect, you have an advantage. We are always going to be tied to the truth. That's just the way we're going to operate. The other example, later that year, was we had a British tanker, the Stena Impero, I believe, that was captured by the Iranians while transiting the Strait of Hormuz. She was steamed north to an Iranian naval base. We're trying to get news out on that. The Iranians, two different parts of the Iranian government, issue wholly conflicting and inaccurate stories about what happened. Why is that important? First of all, they were lies, and they came from the same government and were not even internally consistent, but they got them out first. So that begins to fill the information space while we're struggling to get information out there. I simply cite that example, that long example, to say that in hybrid warfare, the information environment is absolutely critical. Yes, there's a place for tanks and bombs and guns and airplanes and the things that traditional militaries do, but I think, for me at least, the core of hybrid warfare is the information space and how you operate in it, and again, how we operate in it while remaining true to the truth against an opponent who manifestly will not do that.
General McKenzie, thank you. I would like to ask you a question from before you were CENTCOM commander, and ask what challenges did you face as director of the Joint Staff, and what lessons did you learn from this that you applied as CENTCOM commander?
Well, I'll tell you, Michael, being the director of the Joint Staff is one of the great jobs in the U.S. military. If you're going to be a 3-star general and you're not going to be in command of something, it is the best job in the U.S. military. I was lucky. I had a very close relationship with the chairman, but the director of the Joint Staff runs the Joint Staff, about 3,000 people, military, civilian. It's the best staff in the world. They can generate amazing products very quickly. And what you have the opportunity to do is sit there with the chairman and sort of see the entire world. And you can see not only the world, but you also have a ringside show. And actually, you're in the arena. You're not in the ringside, you're in the arena when it comes to operating in the interagency. And so what I learned the most was the ability to, if you're going to be successful with an action, with doing something, you've got to be able to talk to not only inside the Department of Defense, you've got to be able to talk to the Department of State, Department of the Treasury, Department of Commerce, the FBI, the Director of National Intelligence, what we call the interagency. You have to be adept in those meetings. And in those meetings, rank doesn't matter. It's going to be the excellence of your argument that carries the day. So you've got to enjoy the dialectic. You've got to enjoy talking to people. You've got to not mind being questioned by smart, hard trial lawyers that became government officials and know the questions they want to ask. And I found it very rewarding, actually. I think, except for periods in command of troops, my time as the director of the Joint Staff was one of the most remarkable experiences I've had in my career. It's a great job, and most people go on from it to command at the 4-star level. And the reason for that is, you know the system. You're very good. And I found learning the interagency, knowing that, was critical for me when I went down to Tampa and took command of Central Command.
Excellent. General McKenzie, we have lived through some major changes in the past decades, and right now with the Ukraine war going on. My question to you is, what are the major global conflicts, global hotspots that we need to worry about in the future? How do you see security changing in the world in the coming years?
So look, I think the long-term challenge the United States faces is how we're going to deal with China. I think a rising China is the key question for the United States. But we go back to some questions we explored earlier. You've got to deal with other problems at the same time. You got to deal with China globally. You cannot deal with China with a focus on the Western Pacific. Certainly, you need to have forces in the Western Pacific. You need to be prepared to deal with them tactically and operationally there. But you need to realize that China's challenge is a global challenge, and therefore our response must be global. And it must be in the national security domain, but it also needs to be economic. It needs to be diplomatic. It needs to be all those and informational. It needs to be all the elements of national power that we need to marshal. That's the challenge that we face. Now, look, Russia, on the other hand, as you know, is the only country in the world that can actually kill us all in about 40 minutes if they chose to do so. Now, Russia's going to go away too, but you have to respect that capability. They do have a nuclear capability that is equivalent to our own, the only nation in the world that does. Although I need to point out that China is rapidly growing their nuclear capability. And if I would say, I think the greatest challenge we're going to face actually over the long term is how do we integrate also China's growing nuclear capability. In 10 years, China's going to have a nuclear capability that is essentially equivalent to ours, which will mean that all these strategic arms negotiations we've had with the Russians, which are a two-body problem, now will become a three-body problem. And three-body problems are inherently dynamic and unstable, more particularly since the Chinese have not agreed to enter into any strategic arms talks. So how we manage that is going to be a key problem. Look, Russia and Ukraine, acute rather than a long-term problem. I believe we will be able to successfully resolve that. I'm not sure of Russia's staying power here, although we have to be careful that we don't push them into a situation where they do brandish those nuclear weapons. We've also talked about Iran a little bit. I think North Korea remains a significant issue. Their ballistic missiles, since I first began a renewed study of the problem as the J5 in 2014 up on the Joint Staff, they have made significant improvements in their ballistic missile capability. And they do have nuclear weapons. And they do persistently talk about targeting the United States. So we need to pay attention to that. Iran is a regional problem, a significant regional problem, but doesn't threaten the homeland. Iran is not an existential threat to the United States. So if I were to look at the challenges, China first, Russia right there, more not necessarily long-term, but certainly a problem for today. Violent extremism, North Korea, Iran, not necessarily in that order. I put China on top, Russia, and then I would put Iran after them. Then I'd look at North Korea, and then I'd look at violent extremism. Again, it's something we need to learn to live with and be more artful in our response to it.
General McKenzie, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today. It has been a very enlightening and sobering discussion for us, and it's truly been an honor to speak to you. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, and look forward to doing it again sometime in the future. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, General McKenzie. It was a great honor.